This is a story of missed opportunities. Of how New York's finest repeatedly failed to snare the Mafia's most bloodthirsty killer, Roy DeMeo.
What Henry Ford was to automobile industry, Roy was to killing. He streamlined it, he organized it, and he killed with efficiency.
In the 1970s, DeMeo embarked, unchecked, on a murder spree.
But when Roy killed you, your body was not found.
His victims may have numbered as many as 200 people.
Roy DeMeo was as guilty as any serial killer. Not only did he kill them, he cut their bodies up and defamed them and their humanity forever.
People would be killed because they happened to accompany a target.
If you looked up the word evil in the dictionary, his picture would be that.
The big question is, why didn't the police and the FBI stop Roy DeMeo sooner? In 1975, detectives working for the New York Organized Crime Squad made a gruesome discovery. It was a quiet Sunday in Queens. Here, in an alleyway behind the Pantry Pride meat market, the police discovered the remains of a young adult male, stuffed in various garbage bags. The victim was Andre Katz, a small-time criminal.
Andre Katz was a car thief, a very, very good car thief. And he was supplying cars to body and fender places, and he was supplying cars to used car lots.
Katz came from what was then a dangerous part of town, the Canarsie district of Brooklyn. During the 1970s, Canarsie was the city's car crime epicenter. It was infamous for its body shops, garages, and salvage yards. Back then, many of the garages were so-called chop shops, specializing in cannibalizing stolen cars for the parts. But as the discovery of Katz's body showed, somebody had been chopping up more than just cars. No one would realize then that this gruesome discovery was the first clue in one of the most shocking crime sprees ever, begun by one of the Mafia's most bloody murderers, Roy DeMeo. Roy DeMeo's life could have been very different. His mother had wanted him to be a doctor. An uncle was a big-shot prosecutor. Another was a forensic scientist. But Roy DeMeo never showed such promise. After a start as a delivery boy and part-time apprentice butcher, he finally settled on a life of crime instead. By the late 1960s, Roy DeMeo was doing well for himself in his chosen career. He was a successful street thug and racketeer. But DeMeo wanted more. He yearned to become a made man, a fully paid-up member of a mafia crime family. And soon, he got what he had always wanted. One day, he received a call. Somebody was looking for a meeting. The call came from this house. It was the home of Nino Gadji. Gaggi was a mafia captain in the infamous Gambino crime family of New York.
He was brought into the operation by Nino Gaggi, and Nino Gaggi worked for Paul Castellano, who was the head of the Gambino family.
The Gambinos were the most powerful of the 5 crime families that ran the New York underworld. For DeMeo, it was an honor. A meeting with Nino Gaggi could be the first step on the path to becoming made. Gaggi placed DeMeo on the first rung of the mafia ladder. He was made an associate, working in partnership with Nino on various schemes to increase each other's wealth. DeMeo's business interests were a perfect match: loan sharking, gambling, theft. The honeymoon started well. DeMeo expanded his loan shark book. And soon, Roy DeMeo was doing what any mafia boss wants. He was making lots and lots of money. But DeMeo was more than just a loan shark. He was an entrepreneur. He also started to eye up other areas of criminality, like pornography. At this time, hardcore pornography was illegal. Some family bosses, including the Gambinos, frowned upon it. But DeMeo decided it was too good an opportunity to pass up. Nino Gaggi turned a blind eye for one simple reason: the money was excellent. To help him enforce his deals, DeMeo built around him his own specialist team of criminals. It became known as the DeMeo crew. Each member had their own area of expertise. It included Chris Harvey, real name Rosenberg, a 24-year-old with a vicious temper and a love of fast cars and drugs.
Chris idolized Roy. He wanted to be Roy. He wanted to be in the mob.
Freddie DeNome, he was their getaway driver.
Freddie was a racing car driver and was highly respected as a car thief. He could get away with any kind of a police chase.
Other crew members included Joey Testa and Anthony Center, who were so close they were nicknamed the Twins. In all, it was a curious mix of characters, but they were united in their admiration of DeMeo.
They looked at him as a father image. As he moved up the line, he'd be able to move them up the line. Roy was a father figure, a mentor, and their boss.
The gang used to hang out at a bar here on Flatlands Avenue, Brooklyn. Today, it is a church, but at the time, it was called the Gemini Lounge and was the DeMeo gang's clubhouse and base for operations.
Gemini Lounge was a neighborhood watering hole. Wasn't a disco, it was a very quiet bar where a man coming home from work could go in for a drink. The only exception to it was the fact that it was owned by Roy DeMeo.
From his base at the Gemini Lounge, DeMeo started to expand his criminal operation.
Roy was an entrepreneur. He looked at many ways of expanding his business, and he did it tremendously well.
In 1972, he pulled off an extraordinary feat for a career criminal. He moved into the world of finance and got himself elected to the board of directors of a small bank, the Brooklyn Credit Union.
Originally, Roy got involved on the orders of Nino to help launder money.
But DeMeo didn't stop there. He saw an opportunity to steal cash as well as launder it.
So what had happened is Roy moved into it, organized it, but then took it a step further.
DeMeo began to embezzle money. He plundered the bank's capital and got other directors to do the same. By the time he had finished, it went bankrupt. By then, it had netted him and Nino Gaggi hundreds of thousands of dollars. The collapse of a bank, even a small one, could have been a disaster for DeMeo. Because the FBI and tax authorities started to investigate the failure of the credit union. But both Gaggi and DeMeo had already moved on, and nothing could be pinned on them. The result? They were free.
Then they just walked away from it.
DeMeo had managed to elude the authorities. Now, he thought he could get away with anything. Even murder. By 1973, Roy DeMeo was 32. His pornography business was doing well, but DeMeo felt it could do even better. Then, one of his business associates, Paul Rothenberg, was arrested. With Rothenberg under pressure, Roy DeMeo feared he might reveal his own part in the industry, so he planned to take action. In July 1973, he coolly picked Rothenberg up and drove him to a quiet part of town. It was his very first kill. The execution changed him. He found that killing gave him power. He would now not hesitate to murder again whenever an obstacle presented itself. The opportunity to do more killing soon arose, due to DeMeo's increasing interest in another profitable business, car theft. The DeMeo crew was becoming big in lucrative car crime.
They had a highly set up organization of 17 to 20 car thieves a night.
In New York, there was huge amounts of money to be made. A car was often worth more for spares than as a running vehicle.
And everybody had their order. Everybody knew their assignment.
Cars were stolen by his crew and either given new identities or broken down in the Canarsie chop shops.
They were not just to go out to steal any car. They knew exactly what kind of a car they had to steal.
Somebody would want a Jaguar. Somebody would want a Cadillac. Somebody would want a Porsche. They would steal on order the exact car they wanted, the model, the year, the whole routine. Any luxury car you need parts for eventually. So what they started to do then was to chop them up and sell the parts. I mean, it was a very lucrative business.
It was at the height of all this that local car criminal and associate of DeMeo, Andre Katz, got into trouble with the police.
Andre got pinched for narcotics. And they were afraid he would rat out to the police.
Fearing that Katz would squeal, he consulted his mentor, Nino Gaggi.
So after having a meeting with Roy and his capo, Nino Gaggi, The order came down was to kill Andre Katz.
DeMeo prepared an elaborate plan. Katz was lured by a female accomplice into a trap.
He was grabbed by them, and they put a noose around his head and dragged him into a car.
Then, DeMeo and his crew took Katz to the Pantry Pride meat market in Queens. But this time, DeMeo did something different. Inspired by the surroundings, he put his training as an apprentice butcher to good use. That's how Andre Katz ended up in pieces in several garbage bags.
The next thing you see is the headlines. This is a dismembered body found in the back of Pantry Pride. And what a bum thought was a leg of lamb was actually Andre's thigh with a tattoo on it. They wrapped it all up in butcher paper, and it was neatly placed in the fat disposal bin behind Pantry Pride.
In fact, DeMeo had made a mistake. The body parts were found because the rubbish wasn't collected over the weekend. But yet again, DeMeo got away with it. The 1975 police investigation into Katz's murder failed to discover the gang's involvement. No witnesses came forward. No incriminating evidence was found. For retired homicide detective Joe Wendling, the reason was because Katz was the wrong kind of victim.
If it's a store owner and he's killed, there's the outcry. But when an organized crime figure is killed, there is not that much outcry. There's not that much interest that the other detectives place. And I viewed this as a tremendous weakness. And I always went to my boss, and sometimes I had to get down on my hands and knees to beg him, is to let me look into the homicide.
Now, Roy DeMeo began to get a taste for this way of killing.
Roy DeMeo was probably one of the most vicious, uncaring lowlifes that I ever came across.
Dismemberment was rarely used by the Mafia, but for DeMeo, it now became his signature.
He had no respect for human life. He had no respect for anybody except himself. If you looked up the word evil in the dictionary, his picture would be there.
DeMeo found that anyone could be made to disappear.
They would cut the body up, dismember the body, neatly wrap the body, and the parts were placed in dumpsters.
The dumpsters were emptied, and the contents taken to the immense Fountain Avenue dump in Brooklyn.
All of the garbage from Brooklyn and Queens went to that dump.
And the Fountain Avenue dump had a special area designated for meat byproducts. And it had to be covered immediately with dirt. Then the bulldozers covered everything.
So if you dump something there, you're not going to find it ever, ever, ever. So that's why they used it.
More and more people started to vanish.
We had a number of people that disappeared, and we never found them. Here was a group of men that were murdering people, and the bodies were never found.
Today, the dump has long since been filled and landscaped. There is little clue as to the number of bodies DeMeo sent there. As well as using the dump, the crew also disposed of their victims another way.
They dumped a lot of the bodies in the Atlantic Ocean, too. They cut the bodies up, put them in hefty bags, and dumped them off a boat out in the middle of the ocean.
DeMeo became more and more skilled at his job. He was getting so proficient that even the family boss, Paul Castellano, came calling for his hitman services. He had found out that his son-in-law was cheating on his daughter.
One of the bodies was Paul Castellano's son-in-law, and she had a miscarriage because she caught him cheating on her. And Paul had DeMeo kill his son-in-law.
Again, the body was never found. Amazingly, despite all the disappearances, the police department failed to spot a pattern, except one person, Detective Joe Wendling. First Wendling, and then another colleague in auto crimes, John Murphy, spotted something. All these murders were linked to the world of car theft.
I developed an informant that said, look at the amount of car thieves that are disappearing. I think they're cutting them up, and that's why we're not finding them.
But despite his lead, no one took it further. Few shared Wendling's enthusiasm to investigate deeper. In fact, the forces of law and order were in crisis. Financial mismanagement meant recruitment of police was frozen. Morale was low, and the public's faith in the police department had sunk to pitiful levels. The auto crimes unit was overstretched, and the FBI were not interested in local car crime. So these were great times for DeMeo. With nothing to stop him, business boomed. 77,000 cars were stolen in New York City in 1974 alone.
No area in the country is safe from the car thief. It affects everybody in the country. The big metropolitan areas, however, are suffering the most rapid rate of growth.
For DeMeo, the money kept flooding in.
Oh, it was a tremendous epidemic of car crimes in New York. And there was a tremendous slew of warehouses found with skeletons of cars in them.
However, DeMeo wasn't having it all his own way. Another law enforcement unit was looking at his crew's meetings at the Gemini Lounge. It was a separate outfit, the Organized Crime Task Force of the Queens District Attorney's Office and Detective Kenny McCabe.
Kenny was the intelligence officer of the DA's office. He maintained all the organized crime files. He covers all the funerals. He covers all the weddings. And he writes his little notes, and he has folders upon folders of all the families.
Then, Joe Wendling, John Murphy, and Kenny McCabe did what the wider law enforcement community were failing to do. They started comparing notes. Convinced DeMeo was involved in murder, the men started surveillance, but they could only do so in their own time. What had escaped them, though, was that DeMeo had just received a massive promotion. In 1977, Roy DeMeo got what he had always wanted. He became a fully paid-up mobster and was formally inducted into the Mafia crime family.
There was two ways of being made in the mob. You become an earner or you become a hitter, right? You kill somebody, you earn. Roy DeMeo was both.
Roy DeMeo became a so-called made man, working full-time for Capo Nino Gaggi. It was a huge moment in DeMeo's life and the realization of a dream. So DeMeo and his crew were over the moon. With this elation came more murders. It was going so well, the crew even took up freelance work for any paying customer. It was murder for hire, what became known as the murder machine.
Lloyd decided to expand the business into killing. Not just killing enemies, but now killing for the families. He'd take in any contract. He'd invite them to a party, and that would be the last time you see him. That's what Roy did. He expanded the murder.
1979 was a high point for the DeMeo murder machine. To cope with demand, the crew took the killings and dismemberments in-house. Now most hits were done in the rear of the Gemini Lounge, using a well-practiced method.
Now behind the Gemini Lounge there was an apartment rented by a guy named Joseph Guglielmo. They would lure their victims to the place and they would bring them in.
The victim would be shot in the head by Roy DeMeo, and the head swiftly wrapped in a towel. Chris Rosenberg would stab the victim in the heart to stop the bleeding. Then, the body would be left to drain for 45 minutes.
They brought him into the bathroom, put him in the tub. Then they cut the body up and put all the parts in a hefty garbage bag. After they got done cutting the body up and draining the blood out of it in the bathtub, they all sat down with Roy DeMeo and they ordered a pizza, and they were eating the pizza with bloody hands. That's how despicable these people were.
After a while, the dismemberment process became a sadistic ritual.
There was no need to do this. This was just, how would you say it, vicious evilness. I mean, mob heads normally aren't done that way. Why go to that length when they could just put a bullet in his head and dump him in the ocean? They did it just to be vicious. And that was DeMeo's doing because he was a psycho.
Despite killing nearly 100 people, Roy DeMeo could now do bigger and bigger deals. So he got involved in a major plan to export stolen cars to Kuwait. He was now an international criminal. Needless to say, several people were made to disappear in the process. But the plan netted him and Nino huge profits. In no time, orders for 5,000 cars a week were coming in via his contact in Kuwait. As a sideline, DeMeo was getting deeper into cocaine deals as well. Drugs were frowned upon by Paul Castellano, as they tended to attract attention from law enforcement. Nevertheless, mainly through crew member Chris Rosenberg, coke deals came thick and fast. In early 1979, Rosenberg went to Florida to buy some coke off a group of Cubans.
Chris Rosenberg goes down to Florida and goes to a narcotics deal for $1 kilo, and they're going to be delivering it to New York.
On his return to New York, Rosenberg made a major mistake, which would have massive consequences for DeMeo. The Cubans came to deliver the drugs.
They come up to New York to sell him the key. Him being the entrepreneur that he is, says, hey, I'm not going to pay them. I'm going to kill them. And he kills them. He winds up killing 3 people.
The Cubans' bosses were outraged by Rosenberg's actions.
When Roy found out this, he said, they're going to send an army up here And he said, they're gonna kill you. And they said, what name did you use? And he says, I went by Chris DeMeo. Roy says, my God, my family's dead. They're gonna come up here and kill my whole family.
Rosenberg's killings risked an all-out Cuban war with the Gambino clan. In recompense, the Cubans demanded a scalp in what became known as the Cuban Crisis. So DeMeo decided to offer up a sacrifice. His friend, Chris Rosenberg.
So he decides Chris has to go. They stab Chris, he shoots Chris.
They had to make sure the Cubans knew they had kept their part of the deal. So DeMeo could not make the body just disappear. He needed a stunt.
Chris can't be dismembered. Chris has to be left, so it's going to make front page headlines. They parked him on Floyd Bennett Field, sat him in his car, put a 9mm between his legs, and the machine gun in the car. And yes, it did. It made front page headlines.
With Rosenberg gone, DeMeo returned to business. And he remained popular with his Gambino family boss, Paul Castellano, because of his specialist skills.
Roy wasn't going to get killed because Paulie needed his guns. DeMeo and his men were very, very well respected. And this added power to Paulie. Nobody would make a move on Paulie. So that's how important Roy DeMeo was to Paulie.
However, the Cuban crisis did leave a mark on DeMeo. He became paranoid the Cubans wanted to kill him. This caused him to make a major mistake. He mistook an 18-year-old vacuum salesman for a Cuban assassin.
Roy was so nervous about it that a poor Electrolux salesman, going around to the houses in Massapequa, comes up to his house to sell him a vacuum cleaner. They chased this poor individual halfway across Long Island and killed this guy, and then disappeared.
Despite the killing being in broad daylight, law enforcement drew a blank. No witnesses dared come forward. But this time, the Gambino family boss, Paul Castellano, started to get concerned DeMeo was drawing too much attention. Then, in late 1979, Castellano wanted to kill two made men in his family, so he instructed Nino Gaggi and Roy DeMeo to make the hit.
And the order was sent down to Nino Gaggi, kill him, and you do it. So Nino trusted his right-hand man, his top killer, Roy. So they set up a meeting with a father and son. They had them in the car, but the father realized this is not going to turn out well.
A local off-duty policeman saw the murders and gave chase.
A sergeant trying to raise money in his off hours driving a cab sees this flash and everything stops and winds up at a big shootout. Nino gets shot, Roy escapes.
The simple fact was that the murder and shootout involving a policeman was something no one could ignore. So at last, the investigators began to join all the dots between DeMeo and his crew. Between car crime and the numerous Canazzi murders, and between Nino and headman Paul Castellano. Then, the FBI made a key breakthrough. In 1980, a customs official working the docks spotted a consignment of cars destined for Kuwait. It appeared the cars had been stolen and given new registration documents. The intelligence quickly led to a warehouse. The FBI raided it to find it full of stolen cars ready to be exported by DeMeo to Kuwait. A fingerprint at the scene pointed to the DeMeo crew.
It just showed you the scale of the case. Here was a mafia family not only selling stolen cars in Brooklyn, but shipping them out to another country. I mean, this was unheard of. This now became an international case. It became very interesting to everybody, and everybody wanted a piece of the cake.
By 1982, the pressure on DeMeo was stepped up. A new task force moved into offices at Foley Square, New York, to take over the running of the case. It was headed by top-shot prosecutor Walter Mack.
Walter is such a total attorney.
And this guy, Walter Mack, is one of the finest prosecutors I ever met, without any question. I mean, the guy had guts, and he's the one who put this whole case together.
The man just throws himself into a case with his full soul.
Mack's task was to bring all the crime agencies together under one roof.
The team was put together of federal, state, local, city investigators.
The team soon included Joe Wendling.
We sat down, we sparked Walter's interest, and we asked Walter to make a promise to us that if he took this case, he would see it through its end.
Walter Mack did. And soon, it became very clear that what had started as a large-scale car crime case was turning into something even bigger.
The police department at the time had brought an auto crime case over to us. Really wasn't considered a mafia case, although there was some expectation that the mafia would emerge. It was pretty much an auto crime case.
As Mack and the team investigated further, Roy DeMeo's murder machine emerged.
And what happened in the next 6 months to a year was an extraordinary combination of motivated investigators who felt strongly that the individuals in the crew had evaded responsibility for truly heinous acts, and they were looking for some means and mechanism of perhaps drawing it all together.
Slowly and surely, Mack and his team built the case against DeMeo and his boss, Nino Gadji. This time, they were determined they would not elude them.
It was a commitment to the victims, the moms, the husbands, the wives, the brothers, the sisters, that it was time to bring justice to this situation, and that's what kept them going.
One tactic they explored was to pester DeMeo to see if he would crack. Soon, they had something to get him really worried. A major breakthrough. One day, the phone rang. A new informer, calling himself only Harry, professed to knowing all about the stolen car ring. Harry was Vito Arena, an associate of the DeMeo gang.
We take him into Manhattan on a Sunday night with nobody there except the U.S. attorney and us, and we sit him down, And we tell them what we want. We want all the information about the chop shops and the homicides.
Arena began to sing, and their jaws dropped.
Vito Arena sits us down for the next week and a half and fills us in on every homicide they did and how they did them and how they cut the bodies up. Says the easiest part of the body to chop up is the head. The head snaps off like a pencil. And we're like in awe of this guy. We never heard anything like this in our lives. And he tells us all about Roy DeMeo.
To prove his credentials still further, the informant pointed the team to one of the victims, Joe Scorney. His body was found just where Arena said it would be, in a barrel of cement at the bottom of a lake.
We find the body, it was all skeletal now. And there's the dungaree jacket, dungaree pants, and a wallet in his jacket. And by virtue of that wallet, he had his dentist's name in the wallet, which gave us the ID in about an hour.
As a result, Joe Wendling was sent to the Gemini Lounge to confront DeMeo and to offer him a deal to see if he could be turned.
They knew Roy was involved in so many murders, so many killings, that he would be a wealth of information to the police.
Roy DeMeo was having none of it. Instead, Joe Wendling found it was DeMeo who was offering him a deal.
Roy said, "You can take me down. You guys, you're old timers. Why do you want to get involved in it? $1 million, Swiss bank account, wife's name. Give me the former and go live like a king." I turned around to Roy and I said, "I'd sooner take you out of the trunk of your car." I said, "But come with us and I'll save your life." He said, "I'm a good soldier. I'm in the mob. And when they call me, I'll go like a good soldier."
With the case coming together well and evidence building up, it seemed like it was only a matter of time before DeMeo would be in court. Then a disaster that risked ruining everything. As the trial date approached, Roy DeMeo went missing. The police searched for DeMeo. Informants said he was seen on the streets looking paranoid and heavily armed. Then, the police took a call. Roy DeMeo, the ruthless murderer, was found dead in the boot of his Cadillac.
I went down there, when they popped the trunk, there was Roy, frozen to a chandelier. And I said, "Man, what a tribute to us. They killed him. They killed this man who was such a moneymaker to them."
His Cadillac car was dumped in the parking lot behind the Varuna Boat Club in Brooklyn.
Roy DeMeo died the way he lived, as a street rat in the fetal position in the trunk of a car. There was no sympathy or empathy or anything like that from anybody in law enforcement, including myself.
The obvious question was, who might have done it? For the law enforcement team, Gambino family boss Paul Castellano was the man with the motive.
Roy DeMeo was killed because Paul Castellano decided he was a liability. They realized we were getting close to him, to DeMeo, and they felt that if we were able to arrest him and incarcerate him and turn him into an informant, he would have brought the whole empire down.
Castellano was right to be afraid. Even though he was dead, DeMeo had left plenty of damaging evidence. Evidence that would bring destruction to the family. Soon after, the task force raided the Gemini Lounge, armed with a search warrant.
We call our people in, and we take the bathroom apart, and in the drains we found the blood. Blood never goes away, contrary to what you might see on television. If blood is in pipes in a wall, the blood will remain there forever and identifiable. So we were able to do that. We were able to match the blood with the victims and the criminals and the whole routine. That's how we made our case.
This evidence led the team to DeMeo's boss and Castellano henchman, Nino Gaggi. The case evolved into US versus Gaggi. But Paul Castellano wasn't safe either. He too was called to face a trial. As the jury took a 2-week recess at Christmas 1985, Castellano headed out for a steak with a loyal associate. He was cut down by unknown gunmen.
So it was a setup. They bring him up there and they whack him as he's getting out of his car.
Paulie got whacked as a tribute to all of us and Walter, because of the fact we put in all the killers, all the top soldiers. This enabled them to kill Paul.
With Castellano gone, in a final trial, the remnants of the DeMeo crew and their capo, Nino Gaggi, stood trial for the remaining murders, including car thief Andre Katz.
It was not some case that was built overnight, done in a week. It was years of investigating, talking to informers, sending guys to Kuwait, and with the hard work of Walter Mack.
In the end, the worst killer the Mafia ever produced left as his legacy not only a crime family in disarray, but also something more chilling. Only a fraction of his murders had ever been solved. The truth is, we will never know the real number.
Roy bragged about 150 individuals, and I would say we're somewhere between 150 to 200 is probably an accurate number. I think Roy was extremely efficient and vicious in protecting his turf. We had people calling us, about their daughter that disappeared, who, hang out at the bars or stuff like that, and as to which we had no information.
As far as giving victims justice, that's kind of nebulous. How can you ever accomplish that? I'm of the school thinking that there is no such thing as closure for the families of victims. Roy DeMeo was as guilty of serial killing as any serial killer. Not only did he kill them, he cut their bodies up and defamed them and their humanity forever. This was a vicious, evil human being. If you could call him a human being, I wouldn't even call him that.
In missing several vital opportunities to stop DeMeo, the law enforcement machine must take its share of the blame. But that same law enforcement machine did eventually come together. Yet the overriding question remains: could it have done so sooner and found answers for the families of his victims? Benny Siegel, better known as Bugsy, was tall, good-looking, and charismatic, a charmer and a womanizer. He was also a gangster and a killer. He was a man with enemies. Late one June evening in 1947, he arrived at the Los Angeles home of his mistress with a friend. Siegel's mistress was away, and the two men made themselves at home. As with most mob killings, the murder of Bugsy Siegel was never solved. But the one name always associated with Siegel's death is the one name he would have least expected. That of his best friend, Meyer Lansky. Meyer Lansky was one of the most mysterious of all mob figures.
Little Meyer, quite tough, but not really a violent man.
For some, he was the Jewish mastermind behind the Mafia, pulling the strings from the shadows.
He was a financial genius of organized crime. He was also a killer, part of the New York Mafia, and very powerful and very successful.
But for others, he was little more than a middle manager for the mob. His sinister reputation, the product of media hype and hysteria.
The cold, hard evidence suggests that he wasn't quite the business brains that everybody thought he was, or that he thought he was himself.
Mob mastermind, or victim of his own legend. We unravel the enigma of Meyer Lansky. Meyer Lansky arrived in America in 1911 as an 8-year-old boy. He and his family were Jewish immigrants fleeing the brutal anti-Semitic pogroms of their native Russia.
He was scarred by what he saw as a small child. I think Meyer was rather focused on anti-Semitism and his belief that he is not going to lay down the way the Jews in Russia or Poland did, and the way he even felt his father did. And a lot of what Meyer felt being Jewish was not putting up with abuse and fighting back.
His family soon settled in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, New York's impoverished Jewish ghetto.
He grew up in a pretty tough district in New York. And whatever your size was, you had to be tough. You had to be able to take a big beating and give a beating. And so he was small.
Just 5 feet 4 inches, Meyer Lansky quickly learned to use his fists and was soon in trouble with the law. It was at this time he'd first met another young Jewish hoodlum called Bugsy Siegel. The meeting happened when Siegel became involved in a street brawl.
Siegel had these charismatic good looks, and he got involved in a fight, a street fight, and he picked up a gun, and he was so transfixed with the fury of the fight and his anger that he raised the gun and was about to shoot somebody, and they could hear the police coming from all directions. It was only when Meyer sort of physically restrained him and pushed him away that he was able to save him. He said that was the beginning of their friendship, and that, of course, was actually the nature of their relationship.
Lansky was the brains, Siegel was the brawn. Together, the two young men formed the Jewish Bugs and Meyer gang.
You sort of get this sense that, oh, organized crime is Italian. But early in the century, the Jewish rackets were very, very powerful.
The gang stood up to the Italian and Irish toughs that came into their neighborhood to beat up Jews. They also engaged in more lucrative activities.
They were involved in what we'll call small-time criminal activities. Hijacking, loan sharking, gambling.
Lansky and Siegel's big break came in 1920 with the introduction of prohibition, the ban on the consumption of alcohol, a ban which spawned a lucrative illegal trade for mobsters of all ethnic groups.
It was prohibition that turned all of these low-level street predatory criminals into business executives because they had to figure out how to manufacture or import, distribute, sell, run real organizations.
The Bugs and Meyer gang was soon carving a niche for itself in New York's brutal gang wars. And it was at this time that Lansky made what would be the second key alliance of his life, with Italian mobster Charles Lucky Luciano, a man whose respect Lansky first earned when they were teenagers, and Luciano tried to rob him.
Famously, Luciano tried to shake him down, and Meyer told him in no uncertain terms, in very colorful language, where he could get off. You think that because I'm Jewish, I'm just going to fork over money. That's not going to happen today, buddy.
It was the start of one of the most important friendships in the history of organized crime, and of a groundbreaking Sicilian-Jewish alliance.
Luciano really didn't like the old-time Sicilian bosses, the notion that you only stick with your own. A lot of the newer, younger Italians, they didn't really care about the cultural precedent for setting up a gang. It had nothing to do with Sicily. They wanted to make money, and guys like Meyer, who were Jewish, wanted to make money.
With Lansky at his side, Luciano was soon shooting his way to the top of the New York underworld. By the summer of 1931, just one man stood between Luciano and total control: Salvatore Maranzano, a classic old-style Sicilian mob boss. Luciano turned to Lansky for help.
One of the stereotypes of the Jewish rackets is the Jewish guys handled the money and the Italian guys were the tough guys. Not true. Interestingly enough, when Luciano took over the Italian rackets, it was the Jewish muscle that played a big role.
The idea was that if you use Jewish gunmen, we get very ethnic now, if you use Jewish gunmen, the Italian criminals wouldn't be so suspicious because they wouldn't look like Italian hitmen or Sicilian hitmen.
At Luciano's bidding, Lansky organized a gang of Jewish assassins to visit Maranzano's offices on Park Avenue, posing as tax inspectors from the Inland Revenue Service.
One of the guys whose name was Red Levine, who was known for being an Orthodox Jew who would not kill on the Sabbath. But Maranzano was so bigoted that he felt if some Jewish bean counter IRS guys came to his office, they couldn't do him any harm. Well, not only did they do him harm, they killed him.
With Maranzano dead, Luciano became the king of New York and set about establishing the structures of the modern mafia. Meyer Lansky now sat at the right hand of the most powerful mobster in America. But he knew there would always be limits on his power.
Lansky could never be a leader for one reason. He could never be a member because he wasn't of Italian or Sicilian extract. He was a Jew and he knew his place. He was highly respected as somebody who had the ear of Luciano, who could talk to Luciano, and he was a great entrepreneur in criminal endeavors. But he was never a kingmaker or in a position of authority.
From now on, Lansky's role would be that of a chief executive in his various criminal enterprises. Powerful, but answerable ultimately to Sicilian bosses. By now, he'd married and quickly had 3 children, the oldest of whom, Buddy, suffered from cerebral palsy. Otherwise, life was good. He left the crowded tenements of the Lower East Side behind and took an apartment in the exclusive Majestic building, overlooking Central Park on New York's Upper West Side. With the abolition of Prohibition in 1933, he branched out into a new business, one that would dominate the rest of his life.
Meyer Lansky was brilliant mathematically, and his real interest was gambling because he had a knack for it.
Lansky was good with numbers. And the whole idea of gambling is you got to be quick with numbers, you got to know the odds.
He could tell you if it came to craps, well, the proportion for the table was 4.5, and if it was blackjack, it was 5.2.
Gambling was illegal, but widely tolerated, and Lansky was soon running casinos in New York, Florida, and a number of other states. Paradoxically, his casinos made money because they were honest.
The tables would not be fixed because he knew exactly how to take his profit without cheating anybody.
You don't have to be dishonest to win. You have to have volume. As long as you keep gambling, you'll lose.
By the end of the 1930s, Lansky's casinos had made him a wealthy man. But the little Jewish immigrant from the Lower East Side craved something more than wealth.
Right through Lansky's life, there is this wish to be respectable. And right through Lansky's life, there is this feeling that he is not a criminal, that he's a citizen like any other.
There is no doubt that the American people need an adequate merchant marine.
How did Joe Kennedy make his money? What was the foundation of the Kennedy family fortune? Joe Kennedy was a bootlegger, and he was able to launder his fortune and use it to pay his son's way to become president of the United States. Meyer Lansky literally compared himself to Joe Kennedy and felt he was no more immoral than that man had been.
He actually had a snobbish streak. This was somebody who studied history. This is somebody, when his friends were out carousing at night, would hire tutors.
Lansky sent his own second son, Paul, to study at the military academy, West Point.
He would jot down if he saw a vocabulary word that he was interested in. You can see in his handwriting, he would write about it in a book. I remember one of the things he wrote was, determine how to pronounce Thucydides.
The attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 and America's entry into the Second World War provided Lansky with an extraordinary and unexpected opportunity to prove his patriotism and win the respectability he craved. In February 1942, a large troop carrier called the Normandy caught fire and capsized in New York Harbor.
The death of a queen. Now the $60 million luxury liner lies on her side, mortally stricken.
The Navy suspected sabotage. Many of the men who worked on the docks were Italian, a nation America was now at war with. When the Navy attempted to investigate, they found the waterfront an impenetrable, closed world.
The longshoremen by nature are not the kind of guys who take well to men in uniform, government uniform, coming onto the docks and saying, "I'd like you to snitch." So Roosevelt is distraught by this. Pearl Harbor has just happened. The Navy is explaining to him, "Mr. President, we don't control the docks." And Roosevelt is, "What do you mean we don't control the docks? We're the U.S. government." "Well, Mr. President, you were governor of New York. Do you remember who ran the docks?" "Ah, okay."
At that time, the docks in New York were controlled by the mob.
The FBI and the war intelligence authorities suddenly realized the only way they were going to find out about what was going on the waterfront in New York was to actually come to terms with the so-called underworld, figures like Lucky Luciano. The trouble was, Luciano was in jail.
Luciano had been imprisoned in 1936 on charges of organizing prostitution. He was looking at a sentence of 30 to 50 years. The Navy needed a go-between. Enter Meyer Lansky, a Jew who already had impeccable anti-Nazi credentials. In the 1930s, New York's Jewish community had been threatened by the rise of the pro-Nazi German-American Bund. Jewish leaders had turned to Lansky, one of the few members of their community with the muscle to confront Nazi thugs.
The Bund found themselves under siege by Meyer's boys. Meyer and Ben Siegel, and Meyer actually personally went to some of these rallies. They would go and bust them up. They would hit them over the head with bats, and they would really terrorize these Bund members.
When the Navy approached him in 1942 to help them on the docks, Lansky immediately agreed to help. He arranged for Luciano to be moved to a more comfortable jail, closer to New York, and acted as a mediator in talks between the Navy and the Sicilian mobster.
It's an extraordinary story. Lansky says, "Can Luciano be moved?" And then you see, because there was an official inquiry into this after the war, you see the actual document saying, "Move Luciano, Mr. Meyer Lansky is going to come up and visit him. Do not request Mr. Lansky's passport. Do not take Mr. Lansky's fingerprints."
What then resulted was a deal where Luciano could meet with his men in prison, where he hadn't been able to do that before. And yes, he gave the order to cooperate with the Navy, but he also was allowed to conduct business.
It was an extraordinary deal, and it yielded almost immediate results. In June 1942, 8 Nazi spies were arrested following a tip-off from mob-controlled fishermen, an event later trumpeted by the FBI in this publicity film, although the Mafia's role in capturing the spies was not mentioned. The following year provided the mob with an even more dramatic opportunity to lend assistance to the war effort. The invasion of Sicily, home country of the Mafia.
Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano bring Sicilian assets, contacts in New York, to naval intelligence and help design the maps, determine what the tides were, what good invasion locations were, beach terrain, and where Nazi strongholds were.
As American troops poured ashore in Sicily, the mob assistance proved invaluable. But the Navy knew it was playing a dangerous game.
The only thing worse than Operation Underworld, as it was called, failing, what if it succeeds? You're now in business with the mob.
Sicily was conquered in just 6 weeks. But this was not a story that the US government wanted made public. The mob's wartime collaboration was hushed up. Charlie Luciano was released from prison, but immediately deported to Italy. As for Lansky, he found that in the eyes of the government, he remained a hoodlum. His patriotism had failed to win him respectability. And if he really wanted to leave the streets behind, there was another millstone hanging around his neck. Bugsy Siegel.
Siegel stayed on killing people even after Meyer kind of slid out of this, what they used to call the Bugs and Meyer mob. Bugsy Siegel was a wacko. He was a crazy guy, and he did a lot of the... I never saw any indication that Lansky himself ever killed anybody. Siegel, on the other hand, he enjoyed it, and he killed a lot of people. Now, how many, I don't know. Could have been 5, could have been 20.
Siegel had by now moved to California, where his film star looks helped gain him entree to the Hollywood set. But Siegel's dreams were focused elsewhere. A few hours' drive inland, a dusty desert stopover called Las Vegas.
There were these rundown gambling operations in this desert city, Las Vegas, that already existed there. What Siegel realized was these dusty, smoky, rundown places had potential to be something bigger.
The great advantage of Las Vegas was that it was in Nevada, the one state in the Union where gambling was legal. Siegel set about building his own luxury hotel casino, the Flamingo, the first in Las Vegas, with money borrowed from Lansky and other East Coast mobsters. The project quickly ran into trouble.
He never respected budgets. He thought that everything was limitless. And what starts as $1 million ends up becoming, you know what, it's not $1 million, I need 3. You know what, it's not 3, I need 6.
The situation was complicated by the influence of Siegel's girlfriend, glamorous former dancer and mob courier, Virginia Hill.
No.
Her abrasive personality would later be displayed before a Senate commission on organized crime.
I never got money from any of those fellas. None of those fellas. None of these that I've been reading about, and none that I knew. They never gave me anything.
Siegel's mob backers suspected Virginia Hill was stealing their money. But Bugsy Siegel was not the sort of man to listen to criticism of either himself or his girlfriend.
He was a very arrogant guy who would just basically tell him to go screw, you know, and he wasn't going to deal with these. He left it to Lansky to deal with these guys back in the East Coast.
Meyer pleaded with Ben Siegel to get things under control at the Flamingo, to start being more respectful of investors, to stop running around Hollywood going to parties. But you don't tell a 41-year-old man that you're not going to go trick-or-treating if you misbehave.
Eventually, the patience of Siegel's mob backers ran out. Just a few hours after Siegel's death, the Flamingo Hotel received a couple of visitors.
2 men, Mo Sedway and Gus Greenbaum, walked to the Flamingo and said, we're in charge now. And somebody said, well, this is Ben Siegel's place. And they said, Ben is dead.
Mo Sedway and Gus Greenbaum were both business partners of Meyer Lansky's. It is inconceivable Lansky had been unaware of the fate that awaited his oldest friend. 40 years later, after Lansky's death, Lansky's second wife, Teddy, was asked about the murder.
I think he felt badly for the family, and they were buddies from the time they were youngsters.
There were reports that he was involved in the death.
I don't believe that. Circumstances sometimes make you think, but he would never directly have anything to do with anything like that.
Directly.
That's right.
Lansky may not have ordered Siegel's death, but he benefited. For all that he craved respectability, this was the life he'd chosen.
I suppose we could say there's a hypocrisy here. In all my research into Lansky, I never discovered him being personally responsible, personally fingering, personally instructing the death of anyone. But he made his money and he worked in an environment where murder was the ultimate sanction and where those who failed to stick by the code paid in that way.
The image of Lansky as a dangerous mobster was about to become forever established in the public consciousness. In 1950, the US Congress set up the Mafia Commission, its first ever probe into organized crime.
You must have in your mind some things you've done that you can speak of to your credit as an American citizen. If so, what are they?
Paid my tax.
The commission focused primarily on the easy target of gambling, with the result that Lansky emerged as a far more important figure in organized crime than he was. Lansky was furious.
In one of the breaks in the hearings, Meyer said to Kefauver, "Senator, I don't know what you have against gambling. You gamble." And Kefauver snapped, "That's true. I do like gambling. I just don't want you people controlling it. You people." And one of the things that Meyer wrote in private notes is that gambling will become the biggest business in America once they run the Jewish and Italian boys. You people, out of it.
In fact, Senator Kefauver gambled on horses, which was perfectly legal. But for Lansky, it was another example of the hypocrisy of the establishment. The elite always looked upon gambling as an evil, Lansky wrote. Only when they used it as a pleasure or for the purpose of personal gain was it legitimate and not sinful. Once more, he felt he was a victim of anti-Semitism.
You just had to say Jewish financier in the background, working with Italian mobsters. It played to so many stereotypes. It was so damning to Meyer Lansky's reputation. He never recovered from it.
In the aftermath of the Mafia Commission, there was a crackdown on illegal casinos of the type Lansky ran in New York, Florida, and other states.
Let this be a warning to all racketeers and gangsters that they or their ilk will not be tolerated in San Francisco.
For Lansky, his dream of respectability seemed further off than ever. But as one door closed, another opened. Cuba in the 1950s was Las Vegas by the sea.
Cuba was better. Havana was better than Las Vegas. First of all, it was closer to New York. It was close to Florida. They could bring these people on airplanes, you know, quickly, and lots of them. Bring the entertainers in. Have an open city with every kind of vice you could imagine, with girls and pornography and cockfights and whatever guys like. Havana was the best of the best.
Lansky was invited to Cuba in 1953 by Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista to help run the country's casinos.
When Lansky and some of his friends arrived, they were welcomed because they would run straight games. And then from Lansky's point of view, how marvelous to come to a country where they are not hypocritically denounced, but their skills are recognized.
Lansky helped turn Havana into America's playground, where the elite could enjoy all the vices denied them in the newly moralistic atmosphere back home. Among those who visited was future President John F. Kennedy.
Did Meyer know John Kennedy from Havana days, from trips there?
Yes.
What was he looking for in Havana? Gambling, women?
You said the second one.
Oh, a lot of people look for that in Havana.
Oh, yes. He told them where to go for it.
Lansky now embarked on his most ambitious project yet, the construction of the Riviera Hotel Casino on the Havana seafront.
We know from the evidence of the Riviera Hotel that by the mid-50s, he was worth $17, $18 million, which was a lot of money in those days. And he plowed it all into bricks and mortar and air conditioning and gold tiles and so on. It's a wonderful hotel by the standards of the 1950s. It's the first to have air conditioning. You go inside the casino, it's a wonderful mosaic tiled, egg-shaped room. Still with all the glamour of a Humphrey Bogart, Lauren Bacall film. And that's where he put his money.
It was the largest single investment Lansky ever made.
I think Meyer was focusing on Havana to clean up his fortune. That was going to be his Kennedy moment. Havana was legal.
But Lansky had bet wrong. By the time the Riviera opened in 1958, Fidel Castro's leftist rebels were closing in on the capital. In the early hours of New Year's Day, 1959, the dictator fled the country.
At first, the celebration was peaceful as shouting, cheering crowds surged through the city. Then the temper of the throng changed, and an ugly mob ranged the streets. Its prime targets, the symbols of the overthrown regime: the gambling casinos, the parking meters, the homes and businesses of Batista's cronies.
The casinos were looted and then seized by the new government.
6 years of surface.
When Castro came out of the hills, Lansky lost his money, Pepsi Cola lost their money, United Tobacco lost their money, General Motors lost their money. All the big American corporations lost the money that they had. So the world's cleverest gambler, at the end of the day, made a bad gamble.
Lansky now moved permanently to Miami. He was almost 60 and in poor health, but his return to America coincided with a renewed offensive against organized crime.
Attorney General Robert Kennedy paints a grim picture of the rise of lawlessness under the Cosa Nostra, or Mafia. This he describes as the government of organized gambling, narcotics peddling, extortion, racketeering, and controlling of certain trade unions.
With Bobby Kennedy at the Justice Department, the government had the Mafia in its sights. Lansky was still regarded as the mastermind of the mob and found himself under almost constant surveillance.
Meyer is being dogged 24 hours a day, 7 days a week by the authorities, by local authorities, by the FBI.
I knew them by heart. They were my buddies. If I saw them at the racetrack, I used to tell them, I'm going to report you to the FBI. You're not supposed to be gambling.
His wife, Teddy, one time was asked, did your husband have bodyguards? She said, yeah, the FBI. They were always there.
Listening bugs were placed in his house and at hotels he stayed in, but they yielded little. Spends much time lounging around his home, read this report from July the 7th, 1962. Main pursuits seem to be playing gin rummy with friends, watching TV, and reading.
All those wiretaps, bugs that the FBI did in the 1960s, every single bug was successful in getting good stuff, good intelligence for the FBI, except Lansky's. Lansky's was a total zero.
But the bugging did yield one conversation, which has gone down in mob folklore. It happened on the evening of May 27th, 1962. While subject and wife were watching television, the FBI report read, TV panelists referred to organized crime as being second only in size to the government itself. Lansky remarked to his wife that organized crime was bigger than U.S. Steel. Lansky's exact words were not written down, and the tape was then reused, but the report was later leaked to the press. By the time the movie Godfather 2 was made in 1974, the scriptwriters had Hyman Roth, a character based on Lansky, narrowing his eyes and murmuring, "Michael, we're bigger than U.S. Steel."
In fact, the record shows he did not say we are bigger than U.S. Steel. And of course, since it's not recorded, we don't know in what tone he said it. Could he have been sardonic? Could he have been sarcastic and saying, it's bigger than U.S. Steel? We don't know. But he himself would always say, when am I supposed to have said that? But of course, it stuck to him like a sort of catchphrase for the rest of his life, and of course, was finally immortalized on the silver screen.
In March 1970, police finally managed to arrest Lansky at Miami Airport on drugs charges.
The drug bust in 1970 I thought was a travesty and a joke, because basic charge was that he left the country to go to Mexico for a vacation, I believe, and had these drugs on him without having a prescription for it.
The so-called drugs were in fact medicines for a stomach complaint.
I thought it was pure poppycock.
The case was thrown out, but Lansky had had enough. For 40 years he had sought respectability and acceptance as an American citizen. Now he turned his back on his adopted country. In July 1970, he moved to Israel and applied for citizenship.
All through his life, he has had this pride in his Jewish identity. He takes pride in the creation of the State of Israel, which puts into practice the toughness and the courage that he saw back in his youth in Grodno. And here's a whole country that embodies it.
Lansky is living in an exclusive resort hotel, the Acadia, north of Tel Aviv. He's not exactly in the market for publicity.
Lansky found himself pursued by the American media. But while in Israel, he granted Israeli TV a rare interview, presenting himself as a victim of persecution.
Mr. Lansky, if the accusations against you are false, why don't you go back to the United States and demand justice?
I think it would be terribly hard for one to get a fair trial, as much as I believe in the American courts.
Are you a religious Jew?
No, I'm not a religious Jew.
And what are...
But I am a Jew, in my heart.
I think that there was probably a sense that we're all mishpucha, we're all family. And of course they're going to let me in. There's a law, the law of return. What they didn't bank on was that it would be a political hot potato.
The Americans were still pursuing Lansky and were pressuring for his return. The case was referred to Israel's Prime Minister, Golda Meir.
She didn't know Meyer Lansky from hole in the wall. And somebody said he wants to be a citizen of Israel, and she said, fine, I don't see any problem with that. And then another one of her advisors said, you know, well, you understand he's in the mafia. Golda Meir said, mafia? Mafia? No mafia.
Lansky's application for citizenship was denied, and he was expelled from Israel. Lansky's wife, Teddy, arrived back in America literally spitting with fury.
Now look, go away from me, I'll kill you!
Lansky himself was immediately arrested. The government had finally succeeded in putting together a case against him, a case that rested on the evidence of a low-level mobster turned police informant called Fat Vinny.
Fat Vinny was Vincent Teresa, who was a hoodlum from Massachusetts. He was, a thief and an extortionist, and he had been a federal witness in 38 mafia trials that the Department of Justice had brought.
Fat Vinny claimed that in 1968 he'd made 2 deliveries of cash to Meyer Lansky of income from the Colony Club Casino in London. It was the big break the government had been looking for.
Here's a guy who actually was willing to testify, who put money in Lansky's hands, $150,000. That's substantial compared to what his tax return said.
Like Al Capone 40 years before, Lansky was facing charges of tax evasion. Arriving at court, he was relaxed.
Are you pleased with the way your attorneys handled your defense?
I'm sorry, but no comment.
Well, you can't blame me for asking, can you?
No, I don't blame you at all.
Inside, the assistant prosecutor found a man very different from the one he had been expecting.
He was a gentleman, not a wise guy. It was clear that he'd read a lot. He was very articulate, very charming. If you didn't know any better, you'd think he was an executive of an American corporation.
The prosecution was led by a young Justice Department attorney called R.J. Campbell.
We felt that if he had to defend himself, we could really get after him, because I had a mountain of material to cross-examine him on. So I was ready, prepared long and hard for Lansky to take the stand. He did not take the stand. What he did was put his wife on the stand.
Teddy Lansky produced receipts from a hotel to show her husband had been in Boston at precisely the time Fat Vinny claimed to have been handing money to him in Miami.
So, we were hanging by our threads, right? Because once the witness has lied about one thing in his testimony, you are a gone goose.
It was a very thin case. We'd have been better off leaving Lansky in Israel.
Lansky was acquitted. The little man walked free. For some, it was further evidence of his fiendish brilliance. But for others, doubts were beginning to creep in that Lansky really was as rich and powerful as the government and the press claimed.
Let's put it this way, he lived very modestly. We never caught him spending much money on anything. He had nice suits. It doesn't cost that much to buy a suit. He just lived modestly.
Have a good weekend.
So, mastermind of the mob, or as Lansky himself claimed, a retired investor living on a modest pension. only in 1983 would the truth be revealed. Lansky died in his bed of cancer. His family gathered for the reading of the will. They too were hoping it would reveal hidden riches. They were disappointed.
I do believe there was a moment of recognition that, boy, this reality is very different than we thought it would be. Because to my knowledge, nobody in that family has a lot of money, and it's not because they secretly do and have hidden it so cleverly. I don't buy it.
I spent a lot of time with his crippled son, Buddy, who, after his death, was living on state charity, something Meyer had always tried to avoid in his lifetime, but he couldn't leave enough money for his beloved crippled son to survive. I think it defies the rules of human behavior that they would go through such denial of comfort for the sake of proving what?
Meyer Lansky never was the all-powerful godfather some believed. And he lost the bulk of the fortune he had in Havana in 1959. Under constant surveillance by the government, from 1960 he was effectively retired. And he spent most of what he had left on his various legal battles.
How would you describe yourself? As a human being.
He saw himself as a victim of hypocrisy, even anti-Semitism. But Meyer Lansky never was quite the mastermind the American public believed. He shone only in comparison with other mobsters.
Most of these organized crime guys, they're not educated at all. So we're not operating from a very high plane. So a guy comes along like Lansky, who is quick and good with numbers, and he stands out. He's only bright in connection with the other people around him. He certainly wasn't in Bill Gates and Warren Buffett's league.
You know, the cold hard evidence of Meyer Lansky, the businessman, suggests that he wasn't quite the business brains that everybody thought he was, or that he thought he was himself.
But the American public is reluctant to abandon the myth.
The great irony is the proof you are a mastermind is that nobody can find any proof. Everybody was running around looking for banks and pawns in this vast game, and they couldn't find them. And then when they couldn't find them, they said, man, this guy's good. There is this belief, especially in America, in the mystical power of the mob. And so when Meyer Lansky would walk his dog, people would go, ah, he's just walking his dog. He's doing the whole walking his dog low-key ruse. No, he was walking his dog.
This is the story of one family's struggle against the mafia.
We just made a good, honest living, and we weren't even allowed to do that.
It's a story of the power and arrogance of a hidden criminal empire.
They were thought to be invincible. At that time, we never thought about, realistically, getting a mob boss.
The story of how the courage of two honest businessmen enabled police to listen in on the Mafia's darkest secrets.
We shall kill them. Right? Anybody comes near us, we'll kill them.
How can you overcome your own voice on a tape? Can you deny what you said?
It's the story of how the power of the Mafia was finally broken, and of the price paid by those who defied it. Long Island, just outside New York City. A world of neatly manicured lawns and pristine family homes. Plush, suburban, it epitomized the American dream of upward mobility. But beneath the surface was an American nightmare.
I always knew there was something going on with the Mafia, even as a child. My mom would drive me to school a lot, to piano lessons and everything, and one day she said to me, "You know why I drive you all the time is because I need to look after you. I want you to, look behind your back a little bit, especially even at the bus stops, because your father's in a business where we're getting threats."
Kathy's father, Jerry, came from a family of Czech immigrants. Back in the 1950s, he'd started a small garbage collection business. Today, the garbage trucks that patrol the streets of Long Island belong to legitimate companies. But in Jerry Kubecka's day, it was very different.
That had been an intractable problem going back 40, 50 years in the carting industry, the garbage collection industry. It had been run by the mob. Everybody knew it was run by the mob.
There was complete and utter price fixing. It was complete and utter control by a major family of the organized crime group.
Jerry Kubecka had done his best to adjust to reality, joining the mob-run Garbage Association.
There was a gentleman's agreement, so to speak, that one was not supposed to step out and solicit other business, beyond your territory.
Jerry's problem was that, unlike most of the other Long Island garbage collectors, he was not Italian. Despite paying his dues to the mob, he found he was being squeezed out. By 1977, Jerry was weary of the struggle. He handed the business over to his son, Robert, and his son-in-law, Kathy's husband, Donald. Robert and Donald were bright and ambitious. Robert had been to business school, and he saw no reason to play by the Mafia's rules.
My brother wanted to be able to go out and make a living like any other person and do it fair and honestly. And he felt if he calculated bids and everything correctly and won it, it should be his. And he didn't like the dirty politics that were going on. It really upset him. It made him mad.
But Robert was playing with fire. The 1970s saw the Mafia at the peak of its power and influence. In New York, 5 Mafia families dominated great swathes of economic activity. From construction to the waterfront to the garment industry, as well as raking in vast profits from more traditional criminal activities. Out on Long Island, the garbage industry was run by the Lucchese family, an outfit originally set up in the 1930s and headed by an old-style Mafia don called Tony Corallo.
The head of the family, Tony Dux Corallo, was an interesting person. gruff.
He was quiet, peaceable, interesting to spend time with.
Corallo was hired merely to walk into a location and stare at people to keep them in line.
He knew a lot about New York City, knew a lot about a lot of things, unions, union contracts, negotiations.
His major area of concentration before had been labor racketeering.
Corallo was known as Tony Ducks because of his skill in ducking subpoenas. On Long Island, the Lucchese family appeared to operate with impunity. When the Quebecers defied the mob-run garbage cartel and began to compete openly for business, the Lucchese family took it as a direct challenge to their power and authority.
They were designated as being rebels. They would show up to the bids and slap my brother's eyeglasses off his face and threaten him, threaten his life, threaten to beat him up. They would sugar the engines of our trucks. I remember one time they actually threw a firebomb into the cab of the truck that my husband was driving right after he stepped out of it.
Finally, at the start of the 1980s, Robert turned to the authorities.
He had a relationship with one of our investigators, and he explained the problems he was having, how they controlled him, and indicated that there were telephone calls made to him by a particular individual.
Ron Goldstock was head of New York State's Organized Crime Task Force. Located in a small building just north of New York, the task force employed little more than 50 people. Like most of the law enforcement agencies charged with tackling the mafia at this time, the task force had become demoralized.
I walked into the office the first day. There were people with their feet on the desk reading the newspaper. There were no active investigations. There were some indictments that had to be dismissed because of failings. And so it was at once a problem because there was nothing going on. On the other hand, it was an opportunity because you could start literally from scratch and build an organization.
Goldstock galvanized the task force, restructuring it and bringing in outside experts. But the Long Island garbage industry had so far proved a closed, impenetrable world. And so the appearance of Robert Quebecer and his offer to help was a godsend.
He was a rebel. He wanted to do something about it. He wanted his fair share. And he was thoughtful, and he was very helpful.
Quebecer agreed to wear a wire to meetings with other garbage collectors. It was the first step in a chain that would ultimately devastate the New York Mafia. The recordings served to confirm a sworn affidavit from the Quebecer family detailing the harassment they had suffered. And they led investigators to a man named Sal Avellino.
Sal Avellino was the industry specialist for the Lucchese crime family, who controlled the Private Sanitation Industry Association.
On the strength of the affidavit provided by the Quebecers, the task force was able to obtain a court order to tap Avellino's phone. They discovered that not only did he run the Long Island garbage racket, he also had a second, even more important job.
He was also the driver for Tony Duck's Corallo. Avellino had a beautiful black Jaguar, which he used to chauffeur Corallo.
Each morning, Avellino would pick up the Lucchese family boss from his home on Long Island and drive him around to his various business assignments. Ron Goldstock was fairly sure they discussed something more than the weather.
So our next step was to think about how to intercept the conversations he was having with Corallo in that car.
Agents obtained an identical Jaguar. For weeks, they practiced to be able to place a bug beneath the dashboard as quickly as possible. Their chance to do it for real came in March 1983, when Sal Avellino attended the annual dinner and dance of the Garbage Collectors Association and left his car outside. Torrential rain meant the car park was unattended. 3 agents tailing Avellino seized the opportunity.
Big plastic sheets were put over the car. We were inside the car. The stopwatch went on. The bug was placed in. And then we walked away with the bugged car. And within 2 days, the conversations came out clear and wonderful.
He picked up on one job.
Well, it seems that he don't want. He says that Cody is making a beef and complaining about that because this was theirs.
Let him go complain to Fat Tony.
He says this was theirs.
This is the carpenter. Let him go complain to Fat Tony. Listen to me, please.
I'm listening to you.
He's got to go complain to Fat Tony. What the fuck has he got to do with carpenters?
Fat Tony was Anthony Salerno, head of the powerful Genovese family. Already, Goldstock's men were hearing the names of the mob's top bosses.
If you listen to the tapes in the Jaguar, which were collected over a period of months, you hear a lot of profanity. But he also, in a funny way, would sometimes get into ruminating about the life of a mobster with the driver that he was talking to.
Here, the 2 men discuss whether to make their sons. In other words, to induct them into the Mafia.
Make your kid? No, not now. I mean, not my thinking right now is no. Might change 5 years from now, 10 years from now, but right now my thinking is no.
Avellino then reflected his attitude was hypocritical.
If the life was good enough for you, and the life was good enough for you, pointed there, meant for me, if we really believe in it, why wouldn't we want our son? If I were a doctor, I would be saying to my son, since he's a little kid, you're going to be a doctor. If I was a lawyer, I would be looking for my son to be a lawyer. So they must feel that if this life was good enough for me, I want it for my son also. Otherwise, we're really saying that this fucking life is no fucking good for the birds, right?
The task force soon realized that in Sal Avellino, the Quebecers had led them to the perfect target for a bug.
Sal Avellino was an educated individual. He was inquisitive. He wanted to know more. And so he would continually ask Corallo information. He saw Corallo as his mentor.
Here, Corallo outlines to Avellino his opposition to the drugs trade, which he felt left his men vulnerable to law enforcement.
I wouldn't be any fucking plainer than I was with some of these guys, because I don't want nobody coming to them. And they're fucking around with anybody fucking around with junkies. They gotta get killed. That's all. Fuck this shit. You cannot be in a narcotic business and put it on your fucking stomach and then part of the hide it. You gotta be exposed to it. You gotta go out in the street. You got to sell it. You can't be in the drug business without going in the fucking street and sell this cocksucking shit. We should kill them. We should have some examples. All right? All right.
The Organized Crime Task Force was getting an unprecedented insight into the inner workings of a leading mafia family. But they were not the only ones prying into the deepest secrets of the mob. In downtown Manhattan, a revolution was also underway at what should have been the most important of the various agencies charged with tackling the mafia, the FBI.
When I first came in the FBI in February 1970, the FBI was really not equipped to deal with organized crime in a way that could really impact the crime hold that they had on the United States.
At that time, we were a statistic-driven organization. As an agent, you were rated based on how many cases you opened, how many cases you closed, how many indictments you got in a given year, how many arrests you made, and so forth.
The Bureau's legendary director, J. Edgar Hoover, had originally denied even the existence of the mafia and always preferred his agents to focus on other, easier targets. Now, a new generation was forcing its way to the top. It was a generation whose attitudes had been forged in combat.
I was in Vietnam from 1967 to 1968. Spent most of my time up in the demilitarized zone. We sat in that DMZ, basically lived in the ground, taking incoming artillery and rockets from North Vietnam almost on a daily basis. You know, and the feeling of not being able to respond adequately to the war that we were in, not being able to deploy our resources to stop that threat, really having boxes around our capability. It was very, very frustrating. And yes, there were many, many veterans of Vietnam that were populated, you know, into the New York office and populated into other major field offices. And we didn't want to see that all happen again.
Organized crime now became a priority for the New York FBI, and it was restructured to mirror the structures of the mafia itself, with its division into 5 families.
We reorganized the squads along the lines of families, and I basically said, okay, now this is what we know about this family that you are responsible for. What you need to do is to find out the things we don't know, the hierarchy, who manage things, what crimes they're involved in, what industries they're involved in, what unions they control.
The strategy now was to focus not on the foot soldiers, but the bosses. And like Ron Goldstock's task force out on Long Island, the FBI knew the most powerful weapons at its disposal were the bug and the wiretap.
The bug becomes more important than anything. If it was placed properly where these folks were meeting or planning their criminal activity, you could uncover the scope of the problem. You could find out who the actors were in the whole activity. And it was just the best evidence you can get.
I was honored to take over the technical squad and try to build the resources. We had to have experts in locks and alarms. We had to have experts in communications, telephone systems. You know, we had to have all kinds of expertise. We had to fit in as anybody, as a delivery man, as a milkman, as a florist. We had to play all those roles.
Because I told Rockinell, if Spillabody's price is the same as CNA's price, Rockinell will use Spillabody. I got Rockinell. You got the garbage, the garment center, unions, and construction.
By the end of 1983, the FBI was listening in on the conversations of the heads of most of the New York families.
Look at it as a big corporation. You're running a big corporation. The worst thing is that.
Like the organized crime task force out on Long Island, they were getting an unprecedented insight into the culture of the mafia. Here, an unnamed mafiosi berates an underling for failing to attend a meeting.
My wife just called me, Joe.
Your wife just called you? I'm reaching for 2 days. She said she told you yesterday. I need an example. Don't you be the fucking example. You understand me?
Listen, John.
Listen, I called your fucking house 5 times yesterday. Now, if your wife thinks you a dusky or she's a dusky and you're going to disregard my mother phone calls, I'll blow you and that house up.
I never disregard anything.
And you get your ass down and see me tomorrow.
I'm going to be there all day tomorrow.
No, never mind you be there all day tomorrow. And don't let me have to do this again, because if I hear anybody else calls and you respond within 5 days, I'll kill you.
Among the most important of the FBI's targets was Fat Tony Salerno, boss of the Genovese family. The FBI had succeeded in placing a bug in the East Harlem social club Salerno used as an HQ. It would prove second only in importance to the Jaguar bug. On it, agents were astonished to hear Fat Tony dictating who would be the next boss of the powerful Teamsters trade union, which represented almost 2 million Americans, including truck drivers and garbage workers.
I would get the transcripts of things, and when I read it, I said, these bastards are taking over, they're deciding who's going to run the Teamsters nationwide. I mean, I couldn't believe it. We knew that they had infiltrated it, but not to the point where they controlled who could become the president.
But to actually hear that discussion, that type of decision that would impact on all trucking in the United States of America would be made by these mopes, these criminals, you know, these blowhards, in my view, was just sort of shocking.
It was a dramatic illustration of the degree to which New York's 5 families had penetrated legitimate economic activity. But both the FBI and the Organized Crime Task Force were beginning to notice something even more intriguing.
You came to realize that these folks were working together. They might have been individual families that, you know, for work purposes and for power purposes, but in the scheme of things, they were working together, sharing these criminal activities.
Out on Long Island, Ron Goldstock's Organized Crime Task Force was starting to notice the same thing. In the garbage industry, while the Lucchese family controlled the Employers Association, it was the Gambino family who controlled the Garbage Workers Union.
Anybody who was a rebel, who wanted to take away a customer by either offering a lower price or better service, actual competition, their workers wouldn't show up the next day.
Between them, the 2 families had the garbage industry sewn up.
Just Long Island itself probably provided a minimum of $500,000 each to the heads of the Gambino and the Lucchese crime families.
But the bugs were picking up an even more dramatic example of cooperation. For the first time on tape, agents began to hear references to what mafiosis called the Commission.
Now, I told him up there 80 times. I must have said it 80 times. I just put he cannot serve it delicious.
Miami, very.
The Commission had originally been established in 1931 by the legendary Sicilian gangster Charles Lucky Luciano. It was effectively the Mafia's board of directors.
The Commission is essentially the heads of the 5 families, meeting together to resolve problems.
It was kind of modeled on ancient Rome. They would vote to resolve disputes. They would make decisions about who could be admitted to the Mafia and who would not be admitted. And they would serve as a kind of a court of last resort to avoid disputes over territory. And that actually turned out to be a brilliant conception, because based on that vision and that architecture, the Mafia was able for decades to expand its influence and to avoid the kind of internal bloodletting which had been a problem in the 1920s.
They were the bosses. And, you know, we started to realize we're getting the information about the ruling body here.
Law enforcers now took an extraordinary decision to prosecute not an individual or even a whole family, but the entire New York Mafia by targeting the members of the commission. This would mean putting aside interagency rivalry and taking the historic decision to pool the two separate investigations of the FBI and the Organized Crime Task Force. It would also mean making use of a groundbreaking but largely untested piece of legislation called the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO.
What RICO allowed you to do was to take anybody in a large organization that had the objective of committing at least 2 crimes and to charge them as part of a single conspiracy, if you will.
RICO made membership of the Mafia a crime in itself.
Prior to RICO, there was a war of attrition, a war which law enforcement was not winning. And very often, in a Darwinian sense, you took out the lame and the weak and you allowed the strong to survive.
Under RICO, the target was the bosses, even if they had not directly carried out a crime themselves.
It gave you the ability to take everybody in the organization, including the leaders, and hold them accountable for the crimes that had been committed under their authority. And that gave us a lot more scope for bringing large-scale cases directed at very senior members of organized crime.
But first, investigators needed a crime that would implicate members of the Mafia Commission. Surveillance tapes had laid bare a system whereby the 5 families, as a group, took a cut of every concrete deal done in New York. This massively inflated construction costs across the city.
Cement, in those days, the cost of a yard of cement was $42 a yard in New York at the time. To purchase the same amount in New Jersey across the river was $16.
The so-called Concrete Club would form a key part of the prosecution. But to ensure the maximum possible sentences, they needed a second charge, that of murder. They turned to the unsolved 1979 killing of a man called Carmine Galante.
Galante had been the boss of the Bonanno family, which was the 5th family of the major New York families and the one that had gotten involved in drug trafficking.
He was known to deal in narcotics, which was prohibited by the families. And he was considered to be a person who was out of control.
The Mafia Commission disliked the drug trade. This was presented as a moral stance. But, as Tony Duxcarallo's comments in the Jaguar made clear, their real fear was the exposure it gave them to law enforcement, and the likelihood that the stiff sentences it carried could be used to pressure those caught into turning informant. A decision was taken to resolve the problem in the traditional way.
Galante is in the back of a restaurant called Joe and Mary's Restaurant with a couple of other people and some bodyguards. A car drives up. There are 4 masked men. One stays behind the wheel. The others go into the restaurant. They go through the restaurant right to the back, and they kill Galante and 2 of the other people who were with him.
Just a few hours after Galante's murder, a hitman from one Mafia family was filmed being congratulated by a boss from another. For the FBI, this made it very likely the hit had been sanctioned by the commission. Through 1984, investigators continued to gather evidence. On May the 15th, for the first time, they successfully photographed mob leaders attending a commission meeting on Staten Island in New York. Out on Long Island, meanwhile, Tony Corallo and Sal Avellino were continuing their daily seminars on mob etiquette.
Anybody with us, anybody comes near us, we'll kill them.
By now, the bug placed as a result of the cooperation of the Quebecer family was yielding chapter and verse on the mob's control of the garbage industry.
Right now, we as the association, we control the boss, right? Now, when we control the men, we even control the bosses even better now, because now there's even more fucking afraid, right? A strong union makes money for everybody, including the wise guys. The wise guys even make more money with a strong union. Everybody's doing good. Knock on wood, everybody. Let's hope that we can keep it going for the next 15, 20 years.
In fact, time was running out, not just for Tony Corallo and Sal Avellino, but the entire hierarchy of the New York Mafia. On February the 25th, 1985, police swooped.
They're calling it the biggest sweep of underworld leadership in nearly 30 years. 5 reputed godfathers arrested and indicted in New York. They are said to run the 5 most powerful crime families and make up the so-called commission which governs the city's organized crime.
This is a great day for law enforcement, but this is a bad day, probably the worst, for the mafia. This case charges more mafia bosses in one indictment than any ever before.
In all, 9 of New York's most powerful mobsters were arrested, including Big Paul Castellano, head of the Gambino family, Fat Tony Salerno, head of the Genovese family, Carmine the Snake Persico, head of the Colombo family, and Tony Dux Corallo, head of the Lucchese family. The New York Mafia was being shaken to its foundations, and top mobsters were soon turning on each other. On December the 16th, 1985, Paul Castellano, head of the Gambino family, arrived at a steakhouse in mid-Manhattan. Out on bail, while awaiting the start of the trial, he was accompanied by a single bodyguard. The hit was ordered by a rival within the same family, sensing weakness and moving to take control himself. But for the prosecution in the commission trial, it simply meant one less body in the dock. By the time the remaining 8 defendants were hauled into court 9 months later, they were facing a whole range of charges, from extortion through labor racketeering to murder for hire. The tapes made from the Jaguar bug would now form a key part of the prosecution.
The conversations that were obtained as a result of that bug were enormously important because they chatted not just about payments that were being made, although they talked about that too, but they talked about the structure of organized crime. They talked about where their associates were and what particular jobs they had. What they did is describe in detail an organization, an enterprise.
Tony Corallo was in trouble, and his lawyer knew it.
It's one thing to overcome a witness testifying against you, but how can you overcome your own voice on a tape? Can you deny what you said?
The trial began in September 1986, and the defense immediately made a startling concession.
The bold move that was made, and it was made unanimously by all of the defendants, was the admission of the commission, admitting that the commission actually existed. Because it was almost foolhardy to deny it because the tapes established it.
To admit the existence of the commission was to admit the existence of the mafia. The defendants had effectively broken the code of omerta, or silence. A defense lawyer now put forward a novel line of argument, that the mafia was not a criminal organization.
In the opening statement, he admitted that there was such a thing as a mafia. But, you know, so what? So what's wrong with that? And that was his defense. And you had to know that there wasn't going to get any better than that.
The defendants denied involvement in the Galante murder and claimed the concrete racket was a voluntary arrangement. But they were confronted with a mountain of evidence to the contrary, including testimony from mafia turncoats and police spies, surveillance footage, and, above all, hour after hour of secretly recorded conversations. Tony Corallo appeared resigned to his fate.
Corallo just sat stoically, like a man taking his punishment. And I think in many ways that was his attitude. I mean, he obviously, by speaking as openly as he did in the car, it was a major embarrassment. And I think he kind of viewed this as part of his punishment.
He said, whatever's going to happen is going to happen. Just do the best job you can. He said, because this is just a question of time.
The trial lasted just 10 weeks. The verdicts were returned on November the 19th, 1986.
Guilty verdicts today in the federal trial of a group of mobsters accused of being the top bosses of organized crime in the United States.
We went through the first set of charges. Everybody was convicted of something. At that point, we knew that we had won. What wasn't clear until we got 15 or 20 minutes into the verdict, because there were a lot of charges, is that we had won everything, that every count was a conviction. At one point, one of the defendants was overheard saying to the lawyer, doesn't this, ever stop?
The government called Anthony Tony Ducks Corallo, Carmine Jr. Persico, and Anthony Fat Tony Salerno the board of directors of the Mafia. And today, after 6 days of deliberation, a New York jury agreed, finding them and 5 of their associates all guilty of running a racketeering and extortion enterprise.
I think it's going to take a long time to replace the kind of network that these men put together.
The judge now made full use of the RICO Act's ruthless sentencing provisions.
Judge Owen sentenced every one of them to 100 years in jail. I mean, he really sent a message to whoever wanted to become the next boss of those families that, this is what you're facing, 100 years in jail.
Punishment for publicity. It has nothing to do with the public good, and I think the penalty was absolutely excessive.
That was the thing that told the world, you don't have to be afraid of these guys anymore.
For over 50 years, the Mafia had prospered in New York and much of America. It had become woven into the fabric of American life. The Mafia had infiltrated legitimate economic activity and even acquired a certain glamour and mystique. But it would never be the same again.
I think it was one of the great turning points in the history of organized crime, because at that point, everybody within the mob understood that everybody was vulnerable, including each of the bosses.
The leadership of the organization was demolished, sent to jail, all of its secrets were revealed, and much of the accumulated wisdom and experience of decades of criminal behavior was lost to the mob.
If anything makes organized crime organized, it's organization, the ability to communicate with one another. And when you demonstrate dramatically that communication is dangerous, it radically affects the ability of the mob to operate.
But there had been one curious omission from the charge sheet. The place it all started, the Long Island garbage industry, left out because prosecutors felt it would make the trial too unwieldy. Instead, Sal Avellino and his cronies were tried separately before a rather more lenient judge.
The judge decided to give Avellino community service, and then he allowed somebody else to serve that community service for Avellino. I thought it was an outrageous sentence.
It was a joke. It was such a farce.
But the fact the case had come to court had one disastrous consequence. Robert Cabecca's role as an informant was now public knowledge.
Robert became infuriated because his name was never supposed to be disclosed. And he felt like, you know, I put myself out on a limb for you guys, and my name's being disclosed now, and then you're slapping Avellino's hand.
The Mafia remained in control of the Long Island garbage racket, and their intimidation of the Cabeccas continued.
From 1986 until 1989, the threats continued, the damage to the business continued, the damage to the equipment continued, the threats to the customers continued. Nothing had changed.
Furious, far from backing off, Robert and Donald stepped up their collaboration with the authorities, cooperating with a number of investigations. It was a dangerous strategy. On August the 9th, 1989, Robert Cabecca received a series of phone calls.
There were 3. 2 were just kind of veiled threats, and the final was a threat to his life.
They informed the police. But when Donald went home to his wife that night, he appeared unconcerned.
Donald said, "No, Kathy, don't worry about it. We've made our phone calls and contacts to everybody as usual that we've done throughout the years, and they've told us there's no concerns, that we're okay, and I'm going to work in the morning." Much to my dismay, he went.
The 2 men were in the office as usual at dawn the next morning. Robert was shot 3 times and left for dead. Somehow he managed to call for an ambulance. But he died later that day. Donald had been killed immediately. Kathy was told only that there had been an incident involving her husband and her brother. She rushed to the office.
It was a police officer who approached me and actually took me into his car and let me know what happened and asked my opinion of who I thought it was. I said there was only one name I always heard about through the years that was a great threat to the family, and that was Avellino. I said it had to be him.
With Robert and Donald out of the way, the Mafia showed no mercy, muscling in on what was left of the family firm.
Once they died, the women in the family, we had to deal with trying to save the business, and then we had to watch the Mafia come in like vultures and just eat us alive business-wise. I mean, we practically had nothing to sell after a couple of months.
The Quebecers successfully sued the Organized Crime Task Force for failing to protect Robert and Donald. But the authorities did now finally begin an all-out assault on the power of the Mafia in Long Island. In 1993, Anthony Gaspipe Casso, Tony Corallo's successor as boss of the Lucchese family, was arrested. To reduce his sentence, Casso agreed to cooperate with the police and admitted the family's role in the Quebecers' killings. The guy was an informer, Casso said. There's only one way you deal with informers. You kill them. In 1994, Sal Avellino was sentenced to 10 years for helping plan the Quebecer murders. Today, Long Island's garbage companies are free of mob influence. More broadly, the Mafia is now a shadow of its former self. The commission trial that the Quebecers helped kickstart proved the first in a series of RICO-based investigations that would devastate the organization.
These guys are like a street gang now. They've been reduced to that.
Sucking shit. We should kill them. All right? Anybody near comes near us, we'll kill them.
More importantly, the insights gained during the commission and other inquiries helped destroy the glamour and mystique of the mob.
These were not geniuses. These were not people who were strategists. These were people who could hardly understand each other. They were incredibly unsophisticated and incredibly parochial.
Listen to me, please. I'm listening to you. He's got to go complain to Fat Tony. What the fuck has he got to do with carpenters?
It was, as you listen to their intercepted conversation, unbelievable that people with so little understanding could control so much and make so much money.
But the story of the Quebecer family is a reminder of the power the mob once wielded, and of the cynicism, greed, and sordid brutality that was the reality of the Mafia.
What the Mafia has done to me is just tear apart my life. They're run by power, greed, and violence. They're bloodthirsty, power-hungry people. They're monsters. I lost both my husband and my brother to men. I mean, my brother was everything to me. We just made a good, honest living, and we weren't even allowed to do that.